Welcome back to the special webcast of the County Seat. This is an extended conversation about the topic of outmigration of youth and the need to develop rural economies that work in Utah. We've been joined by Delynn Fielding, who is Carbon County Economic Development Director, and Rob Adams, who's a former Beaver County Economic Development Director and is now working in the private industry as a property development director. So we were on the topic of infrastructure, and we got talking about an issue that really didn't have time to be discussed. And so I want to open this up about this whole chicken and egg and what needs to happen in the economy, and then just see where that conversation goes from there.
Okay. Well, you know, I started doing economic development for Beaver County, I believe it was in 2003. And one of the first really good projects we got was a paper recycler, where they take waste office paper like this, they wash it down, and they make tissue paper out of it. Uses a lot of electricity, a lot of natural gas, and a lot of water. And as we looked into that, the community, or the company, liked our community, but we noticed that we're in pretty good shape in Beaver on electricity, but on natural gas, our prices were out of whack. So I've got a really good friend that works for Questar. He's currently on loan to the Economic Development Corporation of Utah. I spoke to him, and I wrote a letter on behalf of, or the County Commission wrote a letter to the Public Service Commission, kind of asking why, and there's some, I don't want to get into the particulars of why our rates were a lot higher than they were in Cedar City and St. George, but they were. And so we started a process there to get those rates equalized to where we would be on a level playing field with other communities. And after 2 to 3 years, we finally got that accomplished with help from the Public Service Commission and the utility, Questar. They were great to work with on it. The other thing that I noticed is that we would get projects that could work very well in Milford. You need to understand about Milford. Milford's a railroad town. If you've got a railroad town where there's a depot right in the community, that spells industrial town to me. And there are a lot of rail-based industry that could move in there. And we started to go after those, and the first thing we found out is that, you know, we're constrained on the amount of power that we can deliver to a given industry. And it was frustrating because the utility can't just go out and extend power lines to areas where there's no demand for it yet. And that's where you get into the chicken and egg conundrum. You can't really bring a company here if you can't serve it with electricity, yet it's not really fair to, the company will choose not to come there if they have to upgrade all of the lines into them. I mean, they can go elsewhere cheaper. And so, you know, we started to work with Rocky Mountain Power on that, and thankfully they're in the process of upgrading those lines, and that situation's being dealt with as we speak. But it took time, and without that, it would never happen. It's difficult to just make that infrastructure just rise from the ground. It always starts with the demand, yet you can't generate the demand without the industry. It's a classic.
You have a situation where the straw that breaks the camel's back, that company has to pay for everything in upgrading the system, and that's prohibitive. And
they won't do it. They don't have to.
They don't have to do it. They can go several other places.
All of a sudden, Ken's is looking real good, right?
Yeah. Really good. So there's a need to be able to. Utah has been blessed in some ways by having extremely low power rates, but at the same time, we're not building the infrastructure. We're not allowing Rocky Mountain to earn a rate of return so that they can provide the capacity for that growth. Or if growth happens, it has to happen in a very concentrated area, the Wasatch Front. And that tends to multiply the problems that, I mean, if you look at the density per square mile, Utah is one of the most urban areas in the nation along the Wasatch Front. And those concentration of infrastructure things help do that. It does a disservice for rural areas, and we have a tendency to create a modern Appalachia unless some of these other things need to be changed.
So the taxpayer who lives on the Wasatch Front, and I think the bill that you have in the legislature is trying to address this a little bit in theory. So the population along the Wasatch Front looks at Carbon County, and they, you know, they look at Sunnyside, and they look at Price, and they look at Wellington, and they go, that's your problem. And they'll look down into Milford and Beaver, and they'll say, well, that's your problem. But is it really just your problem, or do they, beyond just a civic responsibility, is there a returning impact on them, on those of us who live on the Wasatch Front, if you can't develop the resources and economies in the rural part of the state?
Years ago, when electricity and telephone was being put out into the rural areas, the collective wisdom says that we need to have a system that make it available in all of the rural areas, irrespective of the economic cost of doing that, because it is good for the whole country. It is good for the entire state that Emerytown can call New York City, and vice versa, speaking of the telephone situation, and today the internet connectivity. But economically speaking, it never happens. The numbers won't work out unless there's a system in place. But it's good for the overall country not to have pockets of poverty generated by infrastructure lack, natural gas, telecommunications, or power. It's good for the whole country to have those basic needs met every place, and then the whole economy rises together.
You know, to that same argument, there's one thing that most of the Wasatch Front uses rural Utah for, and that's recreation. Sure. We've got great canyons, we've got great climbing, we've got great hiking. A lot of times those people that recreate in southern Utah but live along the Wasatch Front find themselves in life or death circumstances. And who is it that rescues them? Who is it that plucks them from that life or death circumstance? Where are the hospitals that they first go to be treated? If we ignore the basic health of rural economies, everybody suffers. You can carry that argument further. I know that mining sometimes is a dirty word, yet I look around this studio, I see steel, I see copper wire, I see glass, I see a lot of, I see lumber. Mm-hmm. All of those materials come from a rural community. And if we ignore them, it's fine to say, you know, we're going to let all of these extractive industries die, and we're just going to turn all these rural communities into playgrounds. Our economy would grind to a halt in very short order. And one thing, you know, my background is in agriculture. Mm-hmm. And one thing that really bothers people in the agricultural sector of our economy is that most people that live in cities, which is most people by far, have little understanding of where their food comes from, and that's true. But it also extends into, you know, where does the steel come from that makes up the car that you drive? Where does the glass come from that's in your computer monitor?
And if we continue to do that, it will be coming from China, Malaysia.
Right.
And then we got, so that we're even looking at an international problem, because now we're creating a balance of trade problem with a lot of countries that don't necessarily like us very much, and we're becoming dependent upon them. Is that part of the argument? I mean, is that a legitimate part of the argument? There's some people that would say that's a Fox News argument, and it's not really a legitimate argument, but it seems to me that it is.
Well, I do believe that it is, you know, and I mean, personally, I recreate the same way that a lot of the Wasatch Front do. I love to backpack, I like to climb, I like to go through slot canyons, And but I sometimes get frustrated with my urban friends that haven't taken the time to understand how a rural economy functions. And what's particularly frustrating is they haven't taken the time to understand how that rural economy affects their life for the better. And believe me, it does. And you don't have to look far to see the evidence of it.
There needs to be sound economic principles that go along. And the commodities going to China and this kind of a thing, or wheat out of Brazil, but the United States and the entrepreneurial spirit that's in the United States can continue to develop and use the technology and the efficiencies that we know how to do so well, and develop the area and develop the rest of the country and develop rural Utah. It isn't this internationalization of trade is an opportunity for rural Utah, but there's certain things that are absolutely prohibitive that need to be overcome, the infrastructure kind of things that we're talking about, to allow that entrepreneurial spirit to develop and to grow.
When the bill gets into interim committee a little bit, I suppose that will happen during the course of the summer.
Yeah.
I'd like to invite you back for another conversation about the bill specifically, and try to outline that in how it will affect the different parties and what its outcome will be, and some of the things that are being considered, debated on that issue. Would you accept that invitation?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining this extended conversation of the county seat. We will look for you on the air next week, 8 o'clock in the morning on ABC4 and on many of the cable operators, in fact, all the major cable operators around the state. Until then, just keep track of what's happening at the county seat.